The child's handprints on the frost-covered glass looked like a ghost trying to push through from the other side. Marcus Thorne hadn't slept proper in 19 years, and he wasn't sleeping now, just standing at the window past midnight, watching the cottonwoods bend and moan in the October wind. Those trees were 40 years old, planted the same year he'd bought this land back in 1853, back when Montana was still wild enough to break a man or make him, depending on what he brought with him into the territory. The house behind him was dark except for the dying fire in the main room. 2 stories of Victorian architecture that had cost him $12,000 to build in 1880, back when that kind of money meant something. Back when he'd had someone to build it for. The furniture was expensive, the rugs were imported, and every room echoed with the particular loneliness of spaces meant for more people than currently occupied them. Marcus was 48 years old, though most days he felt twice that. He'd built an empire from nothing, starting as a cowhand making $30 a month back in 1865, right after the war ended. 28 years of brutal work, of buying land cheap after the Homestead Act opened up the territories, of learning cattle and weather and men. Now he owned 15,000 acres of prime grazing land in Sweetwater County, worth approximately $225,000 by current assessment. 400 head of Hereford cattle, 8 ranch hands, a foreman he trusted with his life. He was, by any reasonable measure, a millionaire. He was also the loneliest man in Montana. The wind stopped then, dead stopped like God had held his breath. In 28 years of reading weather, Marcus had learned that when nature went suddenly silent, you paid attention. Even the cattle in the distant barn had gone quiet, and animals always knew when something was wrong before people did. That's when he saw it. 5 small fingers pressed hard against the outside of the glass, the frost melting in rings around each one. The handprints were at chest height for him, which meant whoever was making them was small, very small. Marcus moved to the window, his coffee forgotten. The cup was cold anyway. He'd poured it 3 hours ago, back when midnight was still young. He hadn't been able to choke down more than 2 sips. Food and drink had been fuel for 19 years, nothing more. You didn't taste fuel, you just consumed it and kept moving. He reached for the window latch. The double-hung cypress wood frame had been installed in 1880, built to last, built to keep out the Montana cold. His fingers worked the catch, and he pushed the window up. Cold air rushed in like a living thing, dropping the room temperature from 68 degrees to 45 in a matter of seconds. The wind carried the smell of creek water from 2 miles away, and underneath that, the sharp metallic scent of coming snow. A girl crouched beneath the window. She couldn't have been more than 11 years old, maybe 4'6", dangerously underweight at what Marcus estimated to be 52 pounds. She should have weighed at least 65. Her hair was blonde, tangled, and her face was dirty enough that he could see the tracks where tears had carved clean lines through the grime. She wore a flour sack dress. Marcus recognized it immediately. Poor families made clothes from the 50-pound flour sacks, bleaching out the logos, cutting and sewing the fabric into something serviceable. It was common enough in hard times, and these were hard times. The panic of 1893 had hit the country like a hammer 6 months ago. 500 banks had closed across the nation. Cattle prices had dropped from $35 a head to $21. Marcus had lost $5,600 in asset value overnight, and he was wealthy enough to absorb it. Most ranchers weren't. The girl was missing 1 shoe. Her left foot was bare and bleeding, cut by creek rocks. She'd run a long way. 6 miles, maybe 8, based on the damage. But it was the bruises that made Marcus's jaw tighten. Her thin arms were covered in them. Purple and yellow marks, 3 to 7 days old by the look of it. The kind of bruises you got when someone grabbed you hard enough to leave finger-shaped prints. Her lip was split, the blood still wet, and when the wind pushed her hair back from her face, he could see the swelling around her left eye. Someone had beaten this child, recently, repeatedly. She didn't flinch when she looked up at him. That was the worst part. Children who'd been hurt learned not to show fear because fear made it worse. They learned to go still and quiet and wait for the blow to fall and hope it wouldn't fall too hard this time. She looked up at him with eyes he hadn't seen in 19 years, his dead wife's eyes. Catherine's eyes had been gray-blue, a distinctive color that ran in her family. The Whitmore family trait, people called it. Rare enough that you noticed it, Rare enough that when you saw it again, years after Catherine had died alone in a boarding house in Bozeman, it hit you like a fist to the chest. Neither of them spoke. The wind started again, but softer now, almost gentle, like it had delivered what it came to deliver and could rest now. Somewhere in the barn, a horse whinnied, nervous. Marcus hadn't let anyone pass the threshold in 6 years. Not since Catherine left in 1887, taking nothing but a carpetbag and a heart so broken that it had finally stopped beating 3 years later. He'd built walls after that, high walls. He'd locked doors. He'd locked himself behind those doors, and he'd told himself it was better this way. Safer. You couldn't lose what you didn't let in. But the blood on this child's lip was still wet, and the October wind had teeth, and somewhere in his chest, something that had been frozen solid for 19 years cracked just enough to let light in. Marcus reached down and lifted her through the window. She weighed nothing. Corn husk and bone, light as grief, light as regret, light as all the things he'd lost and couldn't get back. He estimated 45 pounds at most. He set her down on the floor by the wood stove, and she didn't make a sound, just pulled her knees to her chest and watched him the way a rabbit watches a hawk, calculating distance, planning escape routes, waiting to see if this predator would strike. The stove was an Acme Oak No. 4, bought in 1889, and it burned through 20 pounds of split wood every night during cold months. Right now, it was radiating heat at about 350 degrees surface temperature, warm enough to take the chill off, not warm enough to make up for running 8 miles through an October night in nothing but a flour sack dress. Marcus knelt down slow. After 28 years of working with animals, he knew how to move around frightened creatures. You kept your hands visible. You moved like you had all the time in the world. You let them see you weren't a threat before you tried to touch them. "You hurt?" he asked. She shook her head. It was a lie, and they both knew it. Marcus had spent 3 decades reading body language, first in cattle, then in men, and the skill transferred well enough to children. This girl was hurt in more ways than he could count, and none of them were going to heal from a warm fire and a kind word. The split on her lip had scabbed over and broken open again, probably from the cold. The bruises on her wrists wrapped around like dark bracelets, and they were finger-shaped. Adult fingers. A man's fingers, if Marcus was any judge. Her bare foot was bleeding from multiple cuts, the kind you got from running hard over sharp flint and sandstone creek rocks. "I ain't going to hurt you," Marcus said. She didn't answer, just kept watching his hands. Smart girl. Hands were what hurt you. Hands were what you had to watch. He stood and crossed to the kitchen, his boots loud on the hardwood floor. The house was too quiet. It had been too quiet for 6 years. He'd gotten used to it the way you got used to winter, by accepting it was a thing that happened and would keep happening until you died. The coffee was still warm on the stove, thick and black in the enamel pot. Arbuckle's coffee, the most popular brand in the West, 20 cents a pound and strong enough to strip paint. He'd been drinking it since 1865. It was familiar, reliable. It didn't ask questions or require answers. He poured a cup and carried it back. Too strong for a child, but it was all he had, and hot liquid was hot liquid. When he held it out, she took it with both hands and held it against her chest as though it were gold. Like maybe nobody had given her anything in a long time. Steam rose between them, curling in the dim light from the dying fire. "Who did this to you?" Marcus asked. Silence. The fire crackled. Outside, the wind threw handfuls of sleet against the windows, testing them. "Where are you from?" She spoke quietly, her voice steadier than expected, like she'd practiced keeping it flat, keeping the emotion locked down where it couldn't be used against her. "Don't matter where I'm from. Matters I ain't going back." Fair enough. Marcus knew about not going back. He'd spent 19 years not going back to the locked room at the end of the hall. 19 years not opening that door, not looking at what was inside, not remembering what it had been like when that room was full of light and laughter instead of dust and grief. He went to the cabinet Catherine had organized years ago, back when she'd still had hope that he might learn to be human instead of stone. The cabinet still held her careful arrangements. Strips of clean cotton, boiled and stored in a sealed tin. A tin of Raleigh's antiseptic salve, gone hard at the edges but still good. A bottle of iodine with its seals still intact, never opened since she had left. He brought a basin of warm water, pumped from the kitchen and heated on the stove. It took 5 minutes to warm properly. He tested it with his elbow, an old cattleman's trick. When it was right, he knelt in front of the girl. Going to clean that foot. Might sting. She nodded once and extended her leg, mechanical, like this was a routine she knew. Like pain was just another chore you got through so you could move on to the next thing. Marcus had seen men twice her age who hadn't learned that lesson. This child had it down to muscle memory. He worked careful, picked out the small stones, 7 pieces of flint and sandstone, dabbed the cuts clean with cotton soaked in warm water. She didn't flinch, not once. He'd seen grown men holler over splinters, but this 11-year-old girl sat there with her jaw tight and her eyes fixed on the middle distance, and she didn't make a sound. "You got a name?" he asked. "Ruth Ann," she said it flat, testing the name in the air between them, maybe testing whether he'd recognize it. When he didn't react, she added, "Ruth Ann Castor." The name meant nothing to him, but something in the way she said it, careful and deliberate, made him look up from her foot. "That's supposed to mean something to me?" "Don't know yet." He didn't push. He'd learned a long time ago that answers came when they were ready, and pushing just made people lock down harder. He wrapped her foot in clean cotton and tied it off gentle, the way he'd wrap a horse's leg. When he finished, he noticed she was shaking. Not from cold anymore. The stove had warmed her. She was shaking from something held too long, something pressing against the inside of her chest like it wanted out. The coffee cup trembled in her grip. A shadow moved in the doorway. Samuel Deer Creek Whitehawk stood there in his long coat, the one made of buffalo hide that he'd tanned himself 20 years ago. His silver braids caught the firelight, and his face was carved from something older than grief, older than the mountains outside. He was 63 years old, Crow Tribe, and he'd been Marcus's foreman for 25 years. $50 a month, which was high for ranch work, but Samuel was worth every penny. He'd heard the commotion, come up from the bunkhouse where the other hands slept. His dark eyes moved from Marcus to the girl and back again, reading the situation with the speed of a man who'd spent 6 decades learning to survive by knowing which way the wind was blowing. He didn't ask questions, just nodded once. A simple gesture that meant, she can stay. Whatever this is, she can stay. Then he stepped back into the night, closing the door soft behind him. Ruth Ann watched him go, her eyes following his shape until it disappeared into the darkness. "Who's that?" she asked. "Samuel. He's been with me longer than the mountains." "He Indian?" "Crow." She considered this for a moment, her head tilted slightly. Then she said, "He got kind eyes." Marcus almost smiled. Almost. It would have been the first smile in 6 years if it had made it all the way to his face. Samuel was known in 3 counties as Stoneface, a man who could stare down drunk cowboys and nervous horses with equal ease. But children and animals trusted him on sight, and maybe that said more about Samuel than any reputation ever could. Don't let him hear you say that. He's got a reputation to keep. He gave her one of Catherine's blankets. Wool, Pendleton brand, bought in 1883 for $8.50, blue stripe at the edge. It had been stored in a cedar chest for 6 years, and it still smelled faintly of lavender soap. Catherine's scent. Marcus hadn't been able to bring himself to wash it. He pointed to the settee by the fire. "You can sleep there tonight. We'll figure the rest come morning." But she didn't lie down, just sat there rigid, the blanket pulled around her shoulders like armor. Staring at the flames, her whole body was tense, coiled, ready to run at the first sign of danger. Marcus lowered himself into the chair across from her. The same chair he'd sat in every night for 6 years, watching the fire burn down to coals, counting his assets in his head like other men counted sheep. 15,000 acres, 400 head of cattle, $225,000 in land and livestock, 47,000 in savings, 18,000 owed to him in outstanding cattle deals. None of it meant anything. His bones ached. 48 years of hard living left marks on a body, but his chest ached worse, and that was the familiar weight he'd learned to carry so long ago he'd forgotten it was there. Until now. until this girl with her silence and her bruises sat in his house like a question he didn't know how to answer. Minutes passed, the fire settled, the wind moaned low and mournful through the cottonwoods outside, and the regulator clock on the wall ticked steady, the way it had ticked through 19 years of empty nights. "You live here alone?" she asked finally. "Just me and Samuel and the cattle." She looked around the room then, really looked. High ceilings, 12 feet tall, a piano in the corner, a Steinway bought in 1881 for $750, untouched for 6 years, gathering dust. Photographs on the mantel that she couldn't quite see from where she sat. "That's a lot of rooms for one man." "Suppose it is." More silence. She pulled the blanket tighter, and then she said it, the thing that made Marcus go completely still in his chair. "You got a sadness on you." Not a question, a fact, delivered plain as weather, plain as saying the sky was blue or winter was coming. "I can see it. Sits on your shoulders like snow that won't melt." No one had spoken to him like that in 20 years. No one had seen him in 20 years. Not past the land and the cattle and the money. He was Marcus Thorne, the millionaire rancher, the man who'd built an empire out of nothing. The man who'd gone from $30 a month to $250,000 in assets through sheer stubborn will and brutal work. He was not a man with sadness on his shoulders, except he was. And this child, this bruised wisp of a girl who weighed nothing and owned nothing and had appeared at his window like a ghost, she'd seen it in the first hour. "I got one too," she said, quieter now. "A sadness. Maybe that's why I found your gate." "What gate?" "The one with the iron sun. It was locked, but I found a gap in the fence. Crawled through." She paused. "Felt like it wanted me to." Marcus's throat tightened. The iron sun gate. He'd had it forged the year Clara was born, 1874. 15 feet of wrought iron shaped into rays spreading outward from a central disk. A rising sun to welcome her into the world. It had been beautiful once. Now rust bled down its bars like old tears, and a heavy chain wrapped the posts, locked tight with a padlock that hadn't been opened in 6 years. He hadn't opened it since the day Catherine left. "Get some sleep," he said, and his voice came out rougher than he intended. "Morning comes early." She nodded and finally lay down, curling into the blanket like a child half her age. Within minutes, her breathing slowed, evened. She was asleep. Marcus sat watching her for a long time. The fire burned down to embers. The wind died to a whisper. He thought about the iron sun gate, rusted and chained. He thought about the gap in the fence he'd never bothered to fix. He thought about Catherine's eyes looking up at him from a face that wasn't hers. Somewhere outside, a coyote called. Another answered. The sounds faded into the dark. He didn't sleep. But for the first time in years, he didn't feel alone in the not sleeping. Morning light made everything look softer. The bruises on her arms, the dust on his piano, the 19 years since anybody had set the table for two. Marcus stood at the stove pushing eggs around a cast iron skillet. The skillet was 12 inches across, bought in 1870, used so many times the bottom was worn smooth. The eggs were burning because he hadn't cooked for anyone but himself in so long he'd forgotten how to pay attention. Coffee boiled black and bitter on the back burner. Biscuits sat heavy as river stones on a tin plate. He looked at the spread and felt something close to shame. Ruth Ann appeared in the doorway. The wool blanket was still wrapped around her shoulders. She'd finger-combed her hair, but it stuck up in the back like straw after a windstorm. The swelling around her eye had gone down some. She looked younger in daylight, smaller, more breakable. "Sit," he said, nodding toward the table. She sat, hands in her lap, back straight, waiting. The posture of a child who'd learned that you didn't reach for things. You waited to be given them, and you were grateful for whatever came. He set a plate in front of her, burnt eggs, 2 biscuits that could break teeth, a cup of coffee he'd weakened with water. She looked at it like he'd laid down gold. "Thank you. It ain't much. It's more than I had yesterday." She ate everything, didn't complain about the char on the eggs or the density of the biscuits, cleaned her plate, and then looked at it like she wanted to lick it, but knew better. When she finished, she said thank you again. Then a third time when he refilled her coffee. Marcus didn't know what to do with gratitude. It made him itch, made him feel like he'd somehow tricked her into thinking he was better than he was. He grunted and turned back to the stove, scraping the burned bits into the slop bucket. The kitchen door opened and Samuel stepped in, bringing cold air and the smell of hay. He hung his hat on the peg, the same peg he'd used for 25 years, poured himself coffee, and sat down across from Ruth Ann like this was any other morning. Like there wasn't a bruised child at the table who hadn't been there yesterday. "You sleep all right?" he asked her. "Yes, sir." "That said he's got a broke spring on the left side. Pokes you if you ain't careful." "I found it. Figured you might." Something passed between them. Not quite a smile, but close. Samuel had a way of making people feel seen without making them feel watched. Marcus had never learned that trick. Ruth Ann's eyes moved around the kitchen, taking inventory. The dried herbs hanging from the ceiling beam, sage and thyme and oregano, remnants of Catherine's garden from 1880 to 1887. The flour tin with the dented lid, a 25-pound Pillsbury tin with a dent from being dropped in 1889. The window over the sink, glass thick and warped with age, and past that, visible through the rippled pane, the locked door at the end of the hall. She didn't ask about it, but Marcus saw her notice. After breakfast, Ruth Ann washed her plate without being asked. Marcus watched her from the corner of his eye. The way she handled the dish, careful, like it might bite her. Like she'd been punished before for breaking things. She dried it with a rag and set it back on the shelf in exactly the spot she'd seen him take it from. "You don't got to do that," he said. "I don't mind." "Didn't say you minded. Said you don't got to." She turned and looked at him, and for a moment he saw something flicker behind her eyes. Confusion, maybe, or the beginning of trust. Then it was gone. "Can I help with chores?" she asked. "No. I'm good with animals. I can muck stalls and haul water." I said no. She closed her mouth, nodded once, but an hour later, when Marcus came back from checking the north pasture fence line, he found her in the barn with Samuel, learning how to brush down the horses. She had a curry comb in her small hand and was working it over the flank of his bay mare. The mare was named Lady, 12 years old and temperamental. She'd kicked 2 ranch hands in the past year, broke one man's ribs. She wouldn't let strangers within 10 feet of her stall. But she stood calm as Sunday for this slip of a girl, ears forward, relaxed. Samuel caught Marcus's eye and shrugged. "She asked." Marcus didn't say anything, just watched for a moment, then walked away. You couldn't argue with results. By midday, she'd made herself useful in ways he couldn't object to. She gathered eggs from the hen house without being shown where it was. 24 Rhode Island red chickens producing 15 to 18 eggs a day this time of year, and she found every nest, even the ones the hens tried to hide. She carried firewood from the pile to the porch, making 4 trips to his one, arms full each time with 20 pounds of split oak and cottonwood. She found a broom somewhere and swept the kitchen floor, raising 19 years of dust that made them both cough. "You always work this hard?" Marcus asked. "Work keeps trouble away." He didn't ask what kind of trouble. He already knew. They ate dinner in the same silence they'd eaten breakfast. Not uncomfortable, just unfamiliar, like 2 people learning each other's shapes. She chewed slow and thorough. He noticed she always left one bite on her plate, then ate it last, like she was saving proof that there had been food at all. Afterward, he walked her around the ranch, the cattle pens with their split rail fences, the hay barn, 60 feet by 40 feet, 2 stories tall, holding 200 tons of loose hay. The smokehouse with 6 hams hanging and 40 pounds of bacon wrapped in cheesecloth. The ice cellar dug into the north hill, 12 feet by 12 feet, 8 feet deep, stone walls keeping 2 tons of ice wrapped in sawdust from last January's cutting. She listened to everything he said, asked questions that made sense, remembered the answers. When they reached the main pasture, she stopped and stared. "All these yours?" "Every last one." 400 head of cattle spread across the valley, red and brown against the yellowing grass. Mountains rising behind them, already capped with early snow. The sky so big, it made a person feel small and free at the same time. "You must be rich as Croesus," she said. Marcus almost laughed. "Almost. Don't feel rich." She looked at him sideways, and he knew she was filing that away too. Another piece of the puzzle she was building. The big house with too many rooms. The piano nobody played. The locked door. the man who had everything and carried sadness like a stone. "You got a cat," she said, pointing. A barn cat had emerged from the shadows. Orange and white, one ear torn from some long-ago fight. Meanest mouser in the territory. It walked straight to Ruth Ann and wound between her legs, purring. Samuel, who'd followed at a distance, shook his head. "That cat don't like nobody. Scratched me 3 times this week." Ruth Ann knelt and scratched behind its torn ear. "Maybe you ain't been polite enough." And Marcus, standing there in the afternoon light with his cattle and his land and his silence, felt something shift in his chest. Something small, something warm. He didn't trust it, but he didn't push it away either. That evening, the light went gold and then gray and then gone. Marcus lit the lamps, all but one. Ruth Ann sat by the fire with the orange cat curled in her lap, both of them watching the flames like they held answers. She'd been quiet since supper, thinking quiet, not scared quiet. He was learning to tell the difference. Her eyes drifted to the mantel, to the photograph there in its tarnished silver frame. "Who's she?" Ruth Ann asked. Marcus didn't have to look to know which picture she meant. He felt it like a bruise pressed. "My wife. She's real pretty." He took a long breath, let it out slow. "Was." Ruth Ann didn't say sorry. Didn't offer the soft words people usually offered, the ones that meant nothing and cost nothing. She just sat there stroking the cat, letting the silence hold what words couldn't. "She die of sickness?" she asked finally. "She—" He stopped. The truth was complicated. Catherine had left him first. Left him for his coldness, his silence, his refusal to grieve out loud. She'd died 3 years later, lone in a boarding house in Bozeman. He hadn't known until a letter came from a stranger. "She passed, long time ago." "You got the same eyes," Ruth Ann said. "Sad ones. Hers in that picture, yours right now." A log popped in the fire. Loud, sharp. Ruth Ann flinched. The cat startled from her lap. And just like that, the softness in the room cracked open, and Marcus saw what lived underneath. The reflex, the fear, the body that had learned to brace before it learned to breathe. She recovered quick, sat up straight, smoothed her dress, but her hands were shaking. Marcus waited a moment, then careful as he'd been with her wounded foot, he asked, "The one who hurt you, he going to come looking?" She didn't answer, which was answer enough. "He's a reverend," she said finally, voice flat. "Reverend Edmund Cross. Got papers that say I'm his. Got the sheriff and the church and everybody believing I'm the liar, and he's the saint." She looked at Marcus then, and her eyes were old. Too old. Nobody believes a child over a man of God. Marcus felt something turn in his chest, something sharp. "I believe you." She blinked once, twice, like she was waiting for him to take it back. He didn't. That night, after she'd fallen asleep on the settee, Marcus walked to the window by the front door, the one that faced east toward the road, toward town. There was a lamp there, hadn't been lit in 6 years. Catherine used to keep it burning whenever he was out riding. A signal, a promise. "I'm waiting. Come home." He struck a match, touched it to the wick. The flame caught, small at first, then steady. He didn't know why he did it, didn't have words for the feeling in his chest. But when he looked back toward the settee, Ruth Ann's eyes were open, watching. She didn't speak, just looked at the lamp, then at him, then closed her eyes again. She slept through the night for the first time in 2 years. On the third moment, she asked about the locked door. He told her it was storage. First lie he'd told in years that made him feel like a coward. Ruth Ann accepted the answer with a nod, but her eyes lingered on the brass handle a moment too long. She knew. Children always knew when adults were hiding something. They just learned not to push. That afternoon, while Marcus was in the north pasture counting heads, making sure none of the 400 cattle had wandered through breaks in the fence, Ruth Ann did what children do when given space and safety. She wandered. He'd told her to stay close to the house, but the land pulled at her. All that open space, all that sky after years of cramped rooms and locked cellars. She walked past the barn where Samuel was mending tack, past the chicken coop where the Rhode Island Reds scratched and muttered, past the small hill where the cottonwoods bent together like old women sharing secrets. And then she found the gate. The iron sun gate stood at the main entrance to the ranch, where the private road met the county track. 15 feet of wrought iron shaped into rays spreading outward from a central disc. It had been beautiful once, commissioned in 1874 when Marcus was still young enough to believe that beautiful things might stay beautiful. Now rust bled down its bars like old tears, and a heavy chain wrapped the posts, secured with a padlock that looked like it hadn't been touched since the day it was locked. Ruth Ann stood before it, small against the iron. The October wind moved her hair. She reached out one hand and touched the cold metal, tracing the curve of one ray. "Mama said, 'Find the iron sun,'" she whispered to herself. "Said I'd know it when I saw it." The chain made a sound, low, almost a groan, like metal waking up after a long sleep. She looked down. The padlock, rusted and ancient, untouched for 6 years according to everything she could see, had slipped its catch. Not broken, not forced, just opened, like it had decided it was time. The chain slithered through the bars with a sound with serpentine motion and fell to the frozen ground with a dull clank that echoed across the empty pasture. The gate swung inward, just an inch, just enough to let the wind through, and with the wind came the smell of distance, of possibility, of things that might be different than they were. Ruth Ann stepped back, heart pounding in her thin chest. She hadn't pulled it, hadn't touched the lock, hadn't done anything except stand there and remember her mother's dying words. But the gate stood open now, and the afternoon light fell through the iron sun as if blessed, like something that had been waiting 19 years for someone to finally see it. Marcus found her there 20 minutes later. She was sitting on a flat stone near the gate, knees pulled up, watching the iron bars catch the dying light. The chain lay coiled on the ground like a dead snake. "What happened here?" His voice came out sharper than he intended, edged with something that might have been fear if Marcus Thorne allowed himself to feel fear anymore. "I don't know." She looked up at him, and there was no guile in her face, no deception, just honest confusion. "I just touched it, and it fell." He walked to the gate, picked up the chain. The padlock was intact, not broken, not forced, not picked, just open, like it had decided to let go after 6 years of holding on. He turned it over in his hands, looking for an explanation that made sense. There wasn't one. Behind him, Samuel's voice came quiet. "That chain ain't slipped in 20 years. Marcus didn't turn around. Wind. Wasn't no wind. Silence. The three of them stood there, the 48-year-old rancher, the 63-year-old Crow foreman, and the 11-year-old girl who weighed 45 pounds and had eyes like a dead woman, looking at a gate that had been locked since grief first taught Marcus Thorne to build walls. "I didn't mean to break nothing," Ruth Ann said, small. "You didn't break it." Marcus crouched down and looped the chain through the bars again, but he didn't padlock it, just wrapped it loose, like maybe it would hold and maybe it wouldn't, and either way the choice wasn't entirely his anymore. "Go on back to the house. Supper soon." She went. Samuel stayed. "You gonna tell me you believe that was wind?" Samuel asked. "I'm going to tell you I don't want to talk about it." Samuel nodded slow. He'd known Marcus long enough to know when to leave a wound alone, but before he turned to go, he said, "Some things that's been locked up too long, they find their own way open. Don't matter if you're ready or not." That night, the stars came out thick and cold, sharp enough to cut. Marcus found himself on the porch with a cup of coffee gone lukewarm in his hands. Ruth Ann appeared beside him without asking permission, wrapped in Catherine's blanket, and sat on the step below. They watched the sky in silence. A coyote called somewhere in the dark. Another answered. The sounds faded into the vast Montana emptiness. "You ever have children?" she asked. The question hit him like a fist. He'd known it was coming, had felt it circling closer for 3 days, but that didn't make it easier. Knowing a storm was coming didn't stop the lightning from striking. "Once." The word came out dry, scraped raw. "A girl. She died long time ago." Ruth Ann didn't look at him, just kept watching the stars like they might rearrange themselves into answers if she looked hard enough. "What was her name?" "Clara." "That's pretty. Means clear, like light." He didn't ask how she knew that, didn't trust his voice to hold steady through another question. His hands tightened on the coffee cup, and the cold ceramic bit into his palms. My mama died too, Ruth Ann said, 2 winters back. Consumption took her slow. She pulled the blanket tighter around her shoulders. Before she passed, she told me things. About where I come from, about a debt owed. What kind of debt? Didn't say exactly. Just said find the ranch with the iron sun. Said the man there owes me something he don't even know about. She paused, and in that pause the whole world seemed to hold its breath. Said you was a good man who forgot how to be good. Marcus's hands tightened on the cup until his knuckles went white. The coffee was cold now, dead cold, like everything else in his life. Your mama, what was her name? Margaret, Margaret Summers. But that wasn't her born name. She changed it when she was young. Said she had to. Born Margaret Castor, changed to Summers when she married my father. He died before I was 2. Mama went back to using Summers, but kept my last name as Castor. Said it was the only thing of his I'd have. Margaret. The name meant nothing to him. But something stirred in the back of his mind, something Catherine had said once, years ago, in the middle of a fight. You don't know everything about me, Marcus. You never cared to ask. He'd thought she was being dramatic. Women got emotional during arguments, said things they didn't mean. He'd learned to weather those storms by going silent, by outlasting the anger until it burned itself out. It had never occurred to him that maybe she was telling the literal truth, that maybe there were whole pieces of her life he'd never bothered to learn. She ever mention a woman named Catherine? He asked. Ruth Ann turned to look at him then, full on, and the lamplight from the window caught her eyes and turned them silver blue in the darkness. That was my grandmother's name, Mama's mama. Never met her. She died before I was born. A pause. How'd you know that? The stars wheeled overhead. The coyotes had gone silent. Somewhere in the house, the lamp in the window flickered, and Marcus couldn't breathe, couldn't think, couldn't do anything except sit there and feel the weight of it crush down on him. Catherine had a daughter before him, before Clara, a daughter she'd never told him about, hidden away, given to relatives, erased from the story of who she was. And that daughter had a daughter, and that daughter was sitting on a hip porch right now, wearing his dead wife's eyes, asking about a debt he was only now beginning to understand. Neither of them spoke for a long while. The cold crept in around them, biting at exposed skin, but neither moved to go inside. Finally, Marcus set down his cup. Your mama ever tell you why Catherine? Why your grandmother gave her up? Said she was young, unwed. Said back then a girl in that situation didn't have choices. Ruth Ann pulled at a loose thread on the blanket. Said Catherine cried when she handed her over. Cried so hard she couldn't stand. Marcus closed his eyes. He could see it now. Catherine at 16, 17 maybe, in 1867 or 1868. Pregnant, terrified. The Whitmore family was old Montana money, owned a bank in Helena, held land and reputation like other families held heirlooms. A bastard child would have ruined everything. Her father was a strict Presbyterian, the kind who believed suffering purified the soul, and forgiveness was something you had to earn through blood and tears. She would have had no choice. Keep the baby and lose everything, family and status and future. Or give the baby away and bury the shame so deep that maybe, with enough years, it would stop hurting. She'd chosen survival, and then she'd spent the rest of her life trying to outrun what survival had cost her. No wonder she'd never told him. She'd already lost one daughter to silence. When Clara died and Marcus locked himself behind walls of grief, refusing to speak her name, refusing to cry, refusing to be human, Catherine must have felt like she was losing another daughter to another man's inability to love out loud. That's why she'd left, not because Clara died, but because Marcus didn't break, didn't weep, didn't do anything except turn harder and colder and more stone-like with each passing day. I ain't asking for nothing, Ruth Ann said quietly. Mama said you owed a debt, but I ain't here to collect. She stopped, started again. I just needed somewhere to go, somewhere he couldn't find me. You got somewhere, Marcus said, long as you need it. She looked at him, searching, waiting for the catch, the condition, the price that always came with safety. He had nothing else to give her, just the truth. I mean it. The days took on a rhythm after that. Ruth Ann helped with chores, feeding chickens, hauling water, brushing down the horses. She learned to make biscuits that didn't break teeth, with Samuel standing beside her at the stove, teaching her the ratio of flour to lard to baking powder that made them light instead of deadly. She named the barn cat Biscuit, which was fitting, and Biscuit followed her everywhere like an orange shadow, purring loud enough to hear from across the barn. She hummed while she worked, hymns mostly. Amazing Grace, How Great Thou Art, songs her mama must have taught her before the consumption took her. Marcus found himself listening for that humming, found himself looking for her when she wasn't in the room. It scared him how quick the house had filled, how loud the silence would be when she was gone. Because she would be gone, he knew that. Reverend Cross would come, or the law would come, or she'd grow up and leave the way everyone left. That was how it worked. That was how it always worked. People came into your life and you let yourself care, and then they left, and the hole they left behind was bigger than the space they'd occupied. But for now, for these few days, she was here, and the lamp burned in the window every night, and the gate stayed unchained. And something in Marcus Thorne's chest was thawing, whether he wanted it to or not. On the fifth morning, a rider came. Ruth Ann saw him first from the kitchen window. She went pale as milk, stepped back fast, hands gripping the counter hard enough that her knuckles went white. Marcus walked out to meet him, positioning himself between the house and the road. The rider was young, maybe 25, rough-dressed in wool and denim. He worked for one of the spreads near town, but his horse had come from the direction of the church, and there was only one church in Dry Creek. Looking for a runaway, the rider said, not bothering with pleasantries. Girl about 11, yellow hair, simple dress, Reverend Cross's ward. Ain't seen nobody like that. Ain't seen nobody, Marcus said. The rider looked past him toward the house, toward the window where a small face had been visible and wasn't anymore. You sure about that, Mr. Thorne? I'm sure. The rider held his gaze a moment too long, weighing whether to push. But Marcus Thorne was the richest man in Sweetwater County, owner of 15,000 acres and political connections that went all the way to Helena. You didn't push Marcus Thorne unless you were ready for him to push back harder. The rider touched his hat brim and turned his horse back toward the road. Marcus watched him go until he was a speck against the gray sky. The wind picked up, carrying the smell of snow. Dark clouds were massing on the horizon, the kind that meant a storm was coming. The kind that could drop 2 feet of snow in a night and leave you trapped for a week. Something was coming. He could feel it in his bones the way he could feel weather. The way 28 years of living on this land had taught him to read the signs that most people missed. The Reverend rode up at noon with the sheriff and a piece of paper that made kindness a crime. Marcus saw them coming from the barn where he'd been checking the winter feed supplies. 2 riders on the county road, one in black, one wearing a tin star that caught the weak November sun. He set down the account book he'd been reviewing and walked out to meet them, positioning himself between the riders and the house. Samuel appeared at his left shoulder without being called, silent and solid. Reverend Edmund Cross dismounted first. He was 52 years old, soft in the middle from years of church suppers and comfortable living. Clean-shaved, wearing a black coat that had been brushed free of dust, expensive wool that probably cost $45. His hands were pale and smooth, the kind of hands that had never roped a steer or dug a post hole or done any work more strenuous than turning Bible pages. The kind of hands that could hurt a child and not show marks the next day. Mr. Thorne, Cross said, and his smile spread slow and satisfied. How good of you to join us. The smile was all mouth. His eyes stayed flat as creek stones, calculating, measuring. Sheriff Grant Matthews climbed down slower, like his bones ached. He was 54, had been sheriff for 12 years, and Marcus had shared whiskey with him more than once, talked cattle and weather, and the slow dying of the frontier. But today Grant wouldn't meet his eyes, and that told Marcus everything he needed to know about where this was going. Marcus, Grant said, voice tired, don't make this hard. Make what hard? Cross reached into his coat and produced a folded paper. He held it out with both hands, reverent, like it was holy scripture instead of just legal documentation. Ruth Ann Castor is my legal ward. Her mother signed custody papers before she passed. Witnessed by the church, filed with the county. He let the paper hang in the air between them. She ran off 5 days ago. Troubled child, makes up stories. I only want what's best for her. Marcus didn't take the paper. What's best for her is staying away from whoever put those bruises on her arms. Cross's smile didn't falter. It was practiced, perfected over years of deflecting accusations and maintaining appearances. Children fall, Mr. Thorne. They play rough. They hurt themselves and blame others when they're caught in mischief. Surely you understand. He tilted his head, all patience and pity. A man of your solitary nature might not recognize the discipline a child requires. The words were chosen careful. Solitary nature. Living alone. The implication hung there like smoke, poisoning the air. I recognize a lie when I hear one, Marcus said. Do you? Cross stepped closer, and his voice dropped soft as a knife sliding from a sheath. Then perhaps you'll recognize this. I have a legal document. I have the sheriff. I have the weight of the church and the county behind me. He paused, let it sink in. What do you have, Mr. Thorne? A big house, empty rooms, a dead wife and a dead daughter, and enough money to buy silence but not forgiveness. The words hit like fists. Marcus felt his hands curl at his sides. Grant Matthews stepped between them, one hand raised out. Now hold on, both of you. Marcus, is the girl here or not? Before he could answer, the front door opened. Ruth Ann stood on the porch, wrapped in the blanket, her face white as bone, but her spine straight. She'd heard them coming. Must have watched from the window, knowing this moment would arrive eventually. Cross's smile widened. There she is, my wayward lamb. Ruth Ann didn't move, didn't speak, but her eyes went to Marcus, and in them he saw something he hadn't seen before. Hope, fragile as frost on glass, waiting to be shattered. She ain't going with you, Marcus said. The law says otherwise. Then the law is wrong. Grant Matthews rubbed his face with one weathered hand. He looked older than his years, caught between a legal paper that was probably valid and the certainty in Marcus Thorne's voice. Marcus, I got no choice here. The document's valid, signed and witnessed. Look at her, Grant. Look at her arms, look at her face. Grant looked, everyone looked. The bruises were visible even from 30 feet away, yellow and purple against pale skin. Children get hurt, Cross said smoothly. That don't prove nothing. Proves enough, Marcus said. Cross stepped forward then, and his voice carried now, pitched for an audience though there was none but the wind and the watching cattle. Mr. Thorne, I understand your attachment. A lonely man, a vulnerable child, an empty house. He paused, letting the implications settle like ash after a fire. Some might wonder what draws a recluse to take in a young girl. Some might ask questions. The accusation hung in the air, poison dressed as concern. You're twisting this, Marcus said, voice low and dangerous. Am I? Cross glanced toward the house, toward the hallway visible through the open door. What's behind that locked door, Mr. Thorne? The one in the hallway. The one you keep shut so tight. Ruth Ann flinched on the porch. She'd asked about that door. She'd wondered. That ain't none of your concern. A man with secrets shouldn't throw stone. Cross spread his hands, the picture of reason. I'm sure there's an innocent explanation. But the town talks, Mr. Thorne. A millionaire hermit, a runaway girl, a locked room. People draw conclusions. Marcus felt the ground shifting beneath him. Everything he'd built to protect himself was being turned into a weapon. The locked door that held Clara's memory, the solitude that held his grief, the kindness he'd finally dared to show. All of it twisted into something ugly. Samuel spoke then. His voice was quiet, but it cut through everything else. That girl's got his wife's eyes. You notice that, Reverend? Cross turned, irritation flickering across his composure. What? Catherine Thorne died 3 years back. That girl's got her eyes. Exact. Samuel walked closer, slow and deliberate. Might be the law gives you a paper, but blood gives Mr. Thorne a claim you ain't counted on. Ruth Ann looked between them, confusion and something like hope warring on her face. Marcus found his voice. Catherine had a daughter before we married. She never told me. Gave her up young, kept it secret her whole life. He met Cross's eyes. Ruth Ann's grandmother was my wife. That makes her kin. That makes this my business. Cross's mask slipped just for a moment, a flash of something cold and calculating beneath the piety. Then it was gone, smoothed away like a wrinkle in cloth. A convenient claim, unprovable, desperate. "I got letters," Marcus lied. He didn't, but Cross didn't know that. Catherine kept letters from her daughter. "I found them after she passed. Names, dates, enough to take to a judge." Cross's jaw tightened. He looked at Grant Matthews. Grant looked at the ground. "This ain't settled," Cross said finally. "I'll be back tomorrow with a marshal from Helena, a federal man. You can tell your lies to him." He turned to Ruth Ann and his voice went soft and sharp as a razor. "I'll see you soon, child. We have much to discuss about honesty and obedience." Ruth Ann didn't flinch this time. She just stared at him with those old eyes. The eyes that had seen too much. The eyes that knew exactly what honesty and obedience meant in Edmund Cross's vocabulary. Cross mounted his horse. Grant followed, still not meeting anyone's gaze. They rode back toward the road, toward the iron sun gate standing open in the distance. When they were gone, Ruth Ann walked down from the porch. She stopped in front of Marcus. "You lied for me," she said. "I did." "What?" He looked at her, this child who'd appeared at his window like a ghost, who'd opened a gate that hadn't moved in 20 years, who carried his dead wife's eyes in a debt he was only beginning to understand. "Because some things matter more than the truth, and you're one of them." Snow began to fall, the first real flakes of the season, drifting down soft and silent as absolution. But absolution, Marcus knew, was still a long way off. He opened the locked door that night. 19 years of dust rose like a congregation of ghosts. The snow had thickened after Cross left, falling steady and silent, covering the tracks of horses and men and lies. Ruth Ann had gone quiet after supper, not her usual thinking quiet, but something deeper. Wounded quiet. She'd watched Marcus through the meal, watched him check the windows twice, watched him not eat a single bite of the stew she'd helped Samuel make. After she'd gone to bed on the settee, Marcus stood in the hallway. The door was in front of him, brass handle dull with years, dark oak, same as the day he'd hung it 19 years ago after the funeral. After they'd put Clara in the ground, and Catherine had stood there dry-eyed because all her tears had already been used up. He'd walked past this door 10,000 times, touched the handle in the dark like a man touching a headstone. Never opened it. Never once in 19 years. Tonight his hand closed around the brass and he turned it. The hinges groaned, a sound like something waking after long sleep. The door swung inward and the smell hit him first. Dust and cedar and something faint beneath. Something that might have been lavender once. The soap Catherine used to wash Clara's hair. He stepped inside. The room was small, smaller than he remembered. A child's room with a child's bed against the wall. White iron frame, white quilt yellowed with age. A window faced east, curtains drawn, fabric gone thin as old skin. A wooden chair sat in the corner where Catherine used to sit and read stories aloud. A shelf held 3 books, their spines cracked. Mother Goose, Grimm's Fairy Tales, The Velveteen Rabbit, and on the pillow, exactly where Clara had left it 19 years ago, sat a porcelain doll. Corn silk hair, blue glass eyes, painted smile that hadn't faded. Catherine had bought it for Clara's 2nd birthday. Clara had named it Rosie and carried it everywhere. To the barn, to the creek, to church on Sundays tucked under her arm like a secret. Marcus walked to the bed. His boots left prints in the dust, the first prints in 19 years. He reached down and picked up the doll. It weighed nothing, just cloth and porcelain and paint. But holding it, he felt the full weight of every day he'd refused to enter this room. Every night he'd touched the handle and turned away. Every year he'd let the dust settle thicker, as if burying the room could bury the grief. It hadn't. The grief was here, waiting, patient as stone. He sat down on the edge of the bed. The springs creaked. The quilt smelled of cedar and thyme. He held the doll against his chest and he didn't cry. Hadn't cried in 19 years. Had forgotten how. But something cracked inside him. Something that had been held too tight for too long. "I'm sorry," he whispered to the empty room. "Clara, I'm so sorry." The words fell into the dust and disappeared. He didn't hear her come in. Ruth Ann stood in the doorway, lamplight from the hall spilling around her small frame. She was wearing one of his old shirts as a nightgown, the hem dragging on the floor. Her feet were bare. Her eyes were wide. She looked at the room, at the small bed, at the doll in his hands, at the man sitting there like something hollowed out. This was hers, Ruth Ann said. Not a question. Marcus nodded. Couldn't speak. Ruth Ann crossed the threshold. Her feet left smaller prints beside his in the dust. She walked to the bed and sat down next to him. Not close, but close enough. Her hands folded in her lap. She was real pretty, wasn't she? Rosie, I mean. That's what you called her. Clara called her that. I know. It's stitched on her dress, see? Little letters. She was right. He'd never noticed. All these years, and he'd never looked close enough to see. Ruth Ann reached out and touched the doll's hair, gentle as a blessing. My mama had a doll once. Lost it when she was young. She used to talk about it sometimes late at night, said it was the only thing she had from before. She paused. Before she got given away. The connection hit Marcus like a physical blow. Catherine's daughter, Ruth Ann's mother, had been given away as an infant with nothing but the clothes on her back. No doll, no keepsake, no proof she'd ever been wanted. And here was Clara's doll, preserved like a saint's relic in a room kept holy for 19 years. All this love locked away. All this grief hoarded like gold. What was she like? Ruth Ann asked. Clara, I mean. What was she like? The question opened something in him. Something he'd kept sealed so long he'd forgotten it was there. She was springtime, his voice broke. He tried again. That's what Catherine used to say. Said Clara came into the world like springtime comes to the valley. All at once, changing everything. That's pretty. It was true. Ruth Ann was quiet for a moment, then soft as snow falling, she asked, how'd she die? The question he'd never answered. The question he'd spent 19 years running from. Fever, scarlet fever. Took her in 3 days. He stared at the doll's painted smile. I wasn't here. I was in Billings, closing a cattle deal. Catherine sent word she was sick, but I thought. He stopped, started over. I told myself she'd pull through. She was strong. She was always strong. But she didn't. No, she didn't. The snow fell harder outside the window, a white silence pressing against the glass. I came back 2 days later, Marcus said. She was already buried. Catherine had done it alone, dug the grave herself because I wasn't there to dig it. Ruth Ann didn't say anything, just sat there, small and still, letting him speak. She called for me. Clara did. At the end, she kept asking for her papa. His hands tightened on the doll. And I was 60 miles away, shaking hands on a deal I can't even remember now. Counting cattle while my daughter died, calling my name. The words hung in the air, terrible and true. Ruth Ann reached over and put her hand on his arm. Her fingers were small and cold. That ain't your fault, she said quietly. Something snapped. Don't. Marcus pulled away, standing up fast. The doll fell to the bed. Don't tell me what's my fault and what ain't. You don't know. You weren't there. Ruth Ann flinched but didn't move from the bed. Why didn't you tell me sooner? The words came out harsh, jagged. About Catherine? About your mama? About this debt you keep talking about? Why'd you show up at my window like some kind of ghost and turn everything inside out? I didn't know. You knew something. Your mama told you to find me, told you I owed her. But she didn't tell you what, did she? Just sent you here to collect on a debt I didn't even know existed. Ruth Ann's face had gone pale, her hands twisted in her lap. I just needed somewhere safe, she whispered. Safe? Marcus laughed, a terrible sound, more like breaking than mirth. There ain't no safe. Don't you understand that? Cross is coming back with a federal marshal. He's got the law, the church, the whole damn territory behind him. And I got nothing but a lie about letters that don't exist. Then I'll go. Ruth Ann stood, her voice small but steady. I'll leave tonight. He won't bother you if I'm gone. I didn't mean, but she was already moving, already backing toward the door, her face closed off the way it had been that first night, waiting for the blow, expecting the betrayal. Ruth Ann, wait, She stopped in the doorway, turned, and her eyes, Catherine's eyes, were full of something worse than fear, full of hope dying. "I ain't your kin," she said. "You said so yourself. I ain't nothing to you." He hadn't said that. Had he? The words jumbled in his head, tangled with anger and grief and 19 years of locked doors. "I ain't her. I ain't Clara. I know you wish I was, but I ain't. And I can't pay a debt I don't understand for people who are dead and gone." She turned and walked out of the room. Out of the hallway, out of the house, the front door opened. Cold air rushed in. Then the door closed and she was gone. Into the snow, into the night, into the dark that had been waiting all along. Marcus stood in the empty room. The doll lay where it had fallen on the white quilt, its glass eyes staring at the ceiling. Outside, the snow swallowed everything. Sound, sight, the small footprints of a girl running into the dark. He'd done it again. Driven someone away with his silence, his walls, his refusal to feel anything that might crack him open. Catherine had left the same way. Not in anger, but in exhaustion. In the slow death of hoping he would break and finding only stone. The door opened behind him. Samuel stood there, snow melting on his shoulders. His face was carved from something older than grief. "She's gone," Marcus said. "I sent her out into—" "I know, I saw. We have to find her. Cross's men could be—" "I'll find her." Samuel didn't move. "But first you're going to listen, because there's something you should have known a long time ago, and I ain't carrying it no more." Marcus turned. "Catherine told me things before she left. Things she couldn't tell you because you wouldn't hear them." Samuel's voice was steady and merciless. "She didn't leave because Clara died. She left because you didn't." The words fell like stones into still water. "You turned to rock, wouldn't cry by, wouldn't speak the child's name. Locked that door and locked yourself behind it and expected Catherine to grieve alone. Same as she'd buried Clara alone." The room tilted. Marcus put a hand against the wall. "She waited 2 years for you to break. Waited for you to hold her and weep with her and be human with her. But you just kept building. More cattle, more land, more walls." He paused. "She told me she still loved you the day she rode off. Said she'd come back if you ever learned to feel again." "She never came back." "No, she died at 3 years ago, alone in a boarding house in Bozeman." Samuel's voice softened. "I got the letter. Didn't tell you because she asked me not to. Said if you hadn't come by then, you weren't coming." Marcus's legs gave out. He sank to the floor, back against the wall, hands hanging useless at his sides. The weight of it crushed him. Not Clara's death, but everything after. The silence he'd chosen, the love he'd refused, the wife who died waiting for him to remember how to be human. "That girl didn't come to collect a debt," Samuel said. "She came to pay one. She came to give you a second chance. And you just sent her into a snowstorm because you're still too scared to let anyone in." "I don't deserve—" "That's what makes it grace. It ain't about deserving. It never was." Samuel crouched down, meeting his eyes. "I'm going to find her. You're going to sit here and decide what kind of man you want to die as." His voice was steady and merciless. "Because that choice is coming, Marcus, sooner than you think." He left. The door stayed open behind him. Marcus sat on the floor of his daughter's room, surrounded by 19 years of dust, and wept for the first time since they put Clara in the ground. Snow fell all night. By morning, every sin was covered, but nothing was forgiven. Marcus stood on the porch before dawn, watching the world turn white. The storm had gentled sometime in the small hours, shifting from fury to patience, and now the flakes came down soft and steady as breath. The cottonwoods were ghosts. The barn was a gray shape in the distance. The iron sun gate stood open at the end of the drive, half buried, waiting. Samuel had ridden out hours ago, hadn't come back. The silence where his report should have been was its own kind of answer. Either he was still searching, or he'd found something he couldn't bear to bring back yet. Either way, Marcus knew what he had to do. He went to the barn and saddled his horse. The bay mare, the one Ruth Ann had brushed that first full day. The one who'd stood calm beneath her small hands when she wouldn't stand calm for anyone else. The leather was cold. His fingers were clumsy. He hadn't slept, hadn't eaten, hadn't done anything but sit on the floor of Clara's room until the weeping stopped and something harder took its place. Something that felt like purpose. Something that felt like the beginning of choosing life over death. He mounted up and rode out into the white. The snow had erased everything. No tracks, no trails. The world was a blank page, and somewhere on it, a girl was written in invisible ink. Lost. Alone. Running from a man who'd promised her safety and then proved himself exactly like all the other men who'd hurt her. Marcus rode past the gate. The chain lay buried now, a dark shape beneath the white. He didn't stop to dig it out. Didn't stop for anything. The road toward town was empty. No riders, no wagons, no sign that anyone else existed in this frozen world. The mountains rose in the distance, their peaks lost in cloud, and the valley stretched out below like a held breath. He didn't go to town. Not yet. There was somewhere else he needed to be first. The hilltop cemetery sat a quarter-mile east of the house, on a rise where you could see the whole ranch spread out below. Catherine had chosen the spot. Said she wanted Clara to be able to watch the sunrise, to see the cattle moving in the spring, to know she was still part of the land even after the land had taken her. Marcus hadn't been up here in 3 years. Hadn't been able to make himself climb the hill, face the stone, speak to the silence that never answered back. Today he climbed. The grave was half buried in snow. The stone was simple. Gray granite, hand-carved letters already softening with weather and time. Clara Catherine Thorne, 1874 to 1880. She was springtime. Marcus dismounted. The wind had died and the silence was so complete he could hear his own heartbeat, could hear the snow settling on his shoulders and hat. He knelt. The cold came through his trousers immediately, biting at his knees, but he didn't move, just knelt there in the snow before his daughter's grave. A man made of stone, finally learning to crack. "I don't know how to do this," he said. His voice sounded strange in the silence. Too loud, too human. "I never knew. Your mama tried to teach me, but I was too proud, too scared." The stone said nothing. The snow kept falling. "I thought if I didn't feel it, it couldn't hurt me. Built walls so high I couldn't see over them. Locked doors so tight I forgot what was behind them." He looked at the carved letters of her name, already filling with snow. "But you were always there, behind every wall, behind every door, waiting for me to be brave enough to remember." A crow called somewhere in the distance, the only other living sound in the world. "There's a girl," Marcus said. "Name's Ruth Ann. She showed up at my window a few days ago, half frozen, beat half to death. She's got your mama's eyes, got your grandmother's blood in her veins, though I didn't know it at first." He paused, gathering strength for what came next. "I think maybe your mama sent her. Or maybe God did. Or maybe grace just works that way. Shows up when you least expect it, wearing a face you almost recognize." He thought about Ruth Ann's voice in the dark. "You got a sadness on you. I can see it." He thought about her hand on his arm in Clara's room. "That ain't your fault." He thought about the way she'd looked at him before she ran, hope dying in her eyes, waiting for the blow that always came. "I hurt her," he said, and his voice cracked. "Same way I hurt your mama. Same way I hurt everyone who ever tried to get close. Pushed her away because I was scared. Because feeling something for her felt like betraying you." The wind stirred. Snow swirled around the headstone like something restless. "But it ain't betrayal, is it?" Marcus's voice broke completely now. "Loving someone new don't mean loving you less. It means—" He stopped, tried again. "It means proving the love was real, that it taught me something, that it made me better instead of worse." He reached out and brushed the snow from the top of the stone. The granite was cold as bone beneath his fingers. "I'm going to find her. Ruth Ann. I'm going to bring her home and keep her safe and be the man I should have been for you, for your mama." His throat was tight, the words barely making it out. "I don't know if I can fix what I broke, but I'm going to try. That's all I got left, the trying." He stood, knees aching, heart aching worse. He looked down at the grave one last time. The snow was already filling in the letters of her name, softening them, covering them. "I love you, Clara. I never stopped. I just forgot how to say it." The wind picked up. The snow thickened. And somewhere beneath the white silence, Marcus thought he heard something. A sound like laughter, like a child running through spring grass, like forgiveness made audible. He mounted his horse and turned toward town. The ride down the hill felt different than the ride up. The weight was still there, would always be there, but it had shifted somehow, settled, become something he could carry instead of something that carried him. Ruth Ann was out there, lost in the snow, or found by Samuel, or taken by Cross. He didn't know which. Didn't matter. He was going to find her either way, because Samuel was right. This wasn't about debt or blood or legal papers. This was about grace. Unearned, undeserved, given freely to those who didn't know how to ask. Ruth Ann had come to give him a second chance, and he'd almost thrown it away because he was too scared to take it. Not anymore. He spurred the mare forward, and the snow parted before him like a curtain, like a door swinging open, like a world that had been waiting 19 years for him to finally walk through. Dry Creek lay quiet under the snow. Smoke rose from chimneys in thin gray columns. A dog barked somewhere and was silenced. The street was empty except for a buckboard outside the general store and two horses tied in front of the church. One black, one gray. Both well-fed and expensive. Cross's horses. Marcus dismounted in front of the livery and handed his reins to the boy who came running. The boy looked at him with wide eyes. Everybody in town knew Marcus Thorne, knew his money and his solitude and the rumors that clung to both like burrs. "Mr. Thorne, sir, there's been—" "I know." Marcus didn't slow down. "Where is she?" "The church. Reverend Cross brought her in this morning. Said she was wandering on the road. Half froze. Said—" But Marcus was already walking. The First Methodist Church of Dry Creek was a white clapboard building with a bell tower that had gone silent 3 winters ago when the rope frayed and nobody bothered to fix it. Marcus had helped build it, back when he still believed in building things. Back when Catherine still sang in the choir and Clara still squirmed in the pew beside him, too young to understand the sermons, but old enough to know that Sunday meant her father would sit still for 1 whole hour. He climbed the steps. The doors were heavy oak, iron-banded, built to last. He pushed them open and walked inside. The sanctuary stretched before him. Rows of wooden pews. A center aisle worn smooth by decades of boots and grief. An altar at the far end with a plain wooden cross hanging behind it. Morning light came through the windows, gray and cold, falling in pale rectangles on the floor. And there in the front pew sat Ruth Ann. She was wrapped in a wool blanket, her hair damp, her face pale as candle wax. Beside her sat Reverend Cross, one soft hand resting on her shoulder like a brand of ownership. A man in a federal marshal's coat stood near the altar, arms crossed, watching. The congregation was there too, a dozen townspeople scattered through the pews. Widow Brennan from the general store, Doc Ferris with his red-veined nose, the Jensens from the feedlot. Others Marcus knew by face, if not by name. Sunday service wasn't for another hour, but word had spread. They'd come to watch. Cross looked up as Marcus entered. His smile spread slow and satisfied. "Mr. Thorne, how good of you to join us." Marcus walked down the center aisle. His boots echoed on the wooden floor. He didn't look at the congregation, didn't look at the marshal, didn't look at anything but Ruth Ann's face. She saw him coming. Her eyes went wide. Fear first, then confusion, then something fragile and desperate that made his chest ache. He stopped at the front pew, looked down at her. "You all right?" She nodded, didn't speak. Cross's hand tightened on her shoulder. "The child is fine. Frightened, cold, but safe now, thanks to God's providence." He stood, positioning himself between Marcus and Ruth Ann. She was found wandering the North Road this morning, nearly frozen. One wonders what could have driven her out into such a storm. "I drove her out," Marcus said, his voice flat. "I said things I shouldn't have, hurt her when I should have protected her." A murmur rippled through the congregation. Cross's smile flickered. "A confession. How unexpected." "Ain't a confession, it's the truth. There's a difference, though I don't expect you'd know it." The marshal stepped forward. He was a hard-looking man, trail-weathered, with eyes that had seen too much to be easily fooled. "Mr. Thorne, I'm Marshal Briggs, out of Helena. I've got legal papers here that say this girl is Reverend Cross's ward. You got anything that says different?" "I got her word. The word of a child." The word of a child who ran 15 miles in the dark to get away from a man who beats her. Marcus turned to face the congregation. His voice rose, filling the sanctuary. Look at her arms. Go on, look. You'll see the bruises, finger-shaped, the kind you get when someone grabs you hard enough to leave marks. Cross's face tightened. The child is clumsy. She falls. She flinches every time someone raises a hand near her, even to wave, even to scratch their own head. Marcus's voice was steel now. That ain't clumsiness. That's what happens to a child who's learned that hands mean pain. Doc Ferris stood up slowly in his pew. His face was troubled, the face of a man who'd been carrying guilt too long. I've treated that girl before. 2 broken ribs last spring. She said she fell off a horse. He paused, swallowed hard. I didn't believe it then, didn't say nothing because, he looked at Cross, because I owed money to the church fund, because I was a coward. The murmur grew louder. Widow Brennan was staring at Cross with new eyes. The Jensens whispered to each other. Cross's mask cracked just for a moment. Something ugly flashed beneath, cold and calculating and cruel. Then it was gone, smoothed away. This is slander, lies from a bitter hermit in a town drunk. His voice rose. The child is mine by law, by right, by the grace of God. God ain't got nothing to do with what you done, Marcus said, and he stepped closer, voice dropping low, low enough that only Cross and Ruth Ann could hear. I've seen men like you before, men who use scripture like a whip, men who pray loud so nobody hears the screaming. Cross's eyes narrowed. You have no proof, no standing. No, I have blood. The words landed like a stone in still water. Marcus turned to the marshal. Ruth Ann's grandmother was Catherine Thorne, my wife. Catherine had a daughter before we married. Gave her up, kept it secret. That daughter was Ruth Ann's mother. He took a breath. That makes Ruth Ann my wife's granddaughter, my kin by marriage, and I'm claiming her. The marshal frowned. You got proof of that? I got letters, Marcus lied again. The lie was getting easier each time, smoothed by repetition. Catherine kept letters from her daughter. I found them after she passed, names, dates, enough to take to a judge. He reached into his coat and pulled out a folded document. Not letters, something else. Something he'd grabbed from his desk before riding out, not knowing why, only knowing it mattered. The deed to the Millbrook parcel, 2,000 acres of prime grazing land on the north side of his property. Worth more than most men would see in 10 lifetimes. Worth approximately $40,000 at current market rates. I'm signing this over, Marcus said, and his voice carried to every corner of the sanctuary, to the town, to the church, whatever you want, in exchange for Ruth Ann's custody, legal and binding. The sanctuary went silent. Even the wind outside seemed to hold its breath. Marshal Briggs took the deed, unfolded it, read it slow, his lips moving slightly. When he looked up, his eyes had changed, harder, wearier, reassessing everything. 2,000 acres. That's a lot of land for a girl who ain't even blood. She's blood enough. Marcus didn't look away. And land's just dirt. She's more than dirt. Cross stepped forward, face flushed. This is absurd. You can't buy a child. The law doesn't work that way. The law works however men with power decide it works, Marcus said, turning to face him fully. You taught me that, Reverend, when you used your church and your papers and your clean hands to beat a little girl and call it salvation. I never... Marcus cut him off, turned to Ruth Ann. Tell them the truth. Whatever happens after, I'll stand by you, but they need to hear it from your mouth. She stood. The blanket fell from her shoulders. She was so small, standing there in the front of the church, dwarfed by the space and the watching eyes. But her voice came out clear as spring water. He locks me in the cellar when I sin. Sometimes for days. Her voice didn't waver. He uses his belt when I talk back. He broke my ribs when I tried to run the first time. She looked at Cross and there was no fear left in her face. Only truth. He prays real loud while he does it. Says he's saving my soul. The congregation erupted. Widow Brennan rose to her feet, her face twisted with horror. The Jensens were shouting. Doc Ferris had his head in his hands, shoulders shaking. Marshal Briggs folded the deed and tucked it inside his coat. Then he walked across and took him by the arm. Reverend, I think you and I need to have a conversation down at the jail. This is outrageous. I am a man of God. God ain't the one pressing charges. The territory of Montana is. The marshal's grip tightened. He led Cross toward the door. The Reverend twisted, looking back at Ruth Ann with something venomous in his eyes. You'll regret this. Both of you. God sees everything. Ruth Ann didn't flinch. So do I. The doors closed behind them. The sanctuary fell quiet again, but a different kind of wine. The quiet after a storm passes. The quiet of something ending and something else beginning. Ruth Ann stood alone in the aisle. She looked up at Marcus and she whispered, You gave away your land for me. I gave away dirt. He knelt down so their eyes were level. You ain't dirt, Ruth Ann. You ain't a debt or a burden or a ghost. You're a child who deserved better than what the world gave you. He swallowed. And I'm sorry I made you think, even for a minute, that you wasn't wanted. Her chin trembled. You mean it? I mean it. She crashed into him, arms around his neck, face pressed against his shoulder, shaking with sobs she'd held in for God knows how long. He wrapped his arms around her and held on the way he should have held Clara, the way he should have held Catherine, the way he'd been too scared to hold anyone for 19 years. The congregation watched in silence. Some of them were crying too, and outside the snow had stopped. Sunlight broke through the clouds, falling through the church windows in long golden beams, lighting up the dust motes like something holy. The snow had stopped by the time they reached the gate. The ride home had been quiet, the good kind of quiet, the kind that doesn't need filling. Ruth Ann sat in front of Marcus on the bay mare, wrapped in his coat, her head leaning back against his chest. She'd fallen asleep somewhere around the creek crossing, exhaustion finally claiming what fear had held at bay. Samuel met them at the barn. He took the mare's reins without a word, but his eyes said everything. Relief, approval, something that might have been pride. He nodded once at Marcus. Marcus nodded back. Some things didn't need language. Marcus carried Ruth Ann inside and laid her on the settee, pulling Catherine's wool blanket up to her chin. She stirred but didn't wake, just burrowed deeper into the warmth. A small sound escaped her lips that might have been contentment. He stood there watching her breathe, in and out, the rhythm of something alive and safe and home. Then he walked back outside. The iron sun gate stood open at the end of the drive, half buried in fresh snow. The chain lay where it had fallen days ago, rusted, ancient, no longer needed. Marcus waded through the drifts until he reached it. He picked up the chain, held it in his hands, felt the weight of it. All those years of keeping the world out, keeping himself in, building walls against a grief that had only grown stronger in the dark. He walked to the barn and hung the chain on a nail beside the horse tack. A piece of history, a reminder of what he'd been, what he'd chosen to stop being. Then he walked back to the gate. The iron sun caught the last light of afternoon, golden now, almost warm. The rust looking less like decay and more like age, like something that had earned its years. He didn't close it, didn't even touch it, just left it standing open. That evening, the fire burned low and the stars came out thick and cold. Ruth Ann woke to the smell of coffee and biscuits. Samuel's biscuits this time, which meant they were actually edible. She sat up on the settee, blanket clutched around her shoulders, and found Marcus in the chair across from her. Same positions as their first night, same fire, same silence. But everything was different. You came for me, she said. I did. Even after what I said about not being your kin. He leaned forward, elbows on his knees. You ain't Clara, I know that. Don't want you to be, but you're something I didn't know I needed until you showed up at my window, half froze and stubborn as a mule. A small smile tugged at her mouth. Mama always said I was stubborn. Your mama was right. Silence again. The fire crackled. Outside, the wind moved soft through the cottonwoods, gentle now, carrying nothing but cold air and starlight. Ruth Ann looked toward the window, the one that faced east toward the road, toward town. The lamp sat dark on the sill. She pushed off the blanket and crossed the room, found the matches on the ledge, struck one, touched it to the wick. The flame caught. Small at first, then steady. Golden light spilled across the glass, pushing back the dark. "What's that for?" Marcus asked. She turned to look at him. Catherine's eyes, Clara's almost smile, something entirely her own. "So you can find your way home, in case you ever forget." Something in his chest cracked open. The last piece of ice that had been frozen there for 19 years. It hurt, that thawing. Hurt worse than the freezing had. But it was a good hurt, the kind that meant you were still alive, still capable of feeling. Outside, the gate stood open. The snow glittered under the stars. And somewhere in the house, a child was humming. Amazing Grace, soft and off-key. The most beautiful sound Marcus Thorne had heard in 19 years. 3 months later, the winter had settled deep into Montana. The ranch was buried under snow, the cattle in winter pastures, smoke rising steady from the main house chimney. Inside, the kitchen table was set for three: Marcus, Ruth Ann, Samuel. A family, though none of them would have used that word yet. It was still too new, too fragile, too precious to name out loud. Ruth Ann was helping cook, her biscuits almost as good as Samuel's now. She wore a proper dress, store-bought from town, paid for with Marcus's money, and chosen by Widow Brennan, who'd appointed herself the girl's unofficial guardian of feminine proprieties. Her hair was clean and braided. The bruises had faded to nothing. She hummed while she worked. It had become her habit, a sign that she felt safe. The legal matters had been settled. Marshal Briggs had taken Marcus's deed and filed it with the county. 2,000 acres transferred to the town of Dry Creek to be used for a proper school and orphanage. One that would be overseen by a board, not a single man. One where children would be protected instead of hurt. Reverend Cross's trial was set for spring. After Ruth Ann had testified, 3 other children had come forward. Then 5 more. The house of cards that Cross had built on piety and fear had collapsed in a single week. Marcus had his ward, legal and binding. Ruth Ann Castor, formerly ward of Edmund Cross, now ward of Marcus Thorne. The paperwork had been signed by a judge in Helena who'd looked at the bruises in the photographs Doc Ferris had finally taken, looked at the deed Marcus had given up, and made his decision in under 5 minutes. The community had apologized in its awkward way. Widow Brennan brought pie every week, her face tight with guilt she couldn't quite articulate. Doc Ferris treated Ruth Ann for free, his penance for years of looking the other way. The Jensens nodded respectfully when they saw Marcus in town, a gesture that said, "We were wrong about you," without having to use words. Marcus attended town meetings now, first time in years, spoke when he had something to say, was learning slowly to be part of the world again instead of separate from it. He laughed sometimes. The sound was rusty, unpracticed, but real. Ruth Ann had discovered she could make him laugh by doing impressions of Biscuit the cat, who had grown fat and lazy over the winter and now spent most of his time sleeping on the warmest spot in the house. The iron sun gate stayed open. Snow drifted through it, wind blew through it, and once a week Marcus walked out to check on it. Not to close it, just to make sure it was still there, still standing, still welcoming instead of forbidding. They ate dinner together, the 3 of them. Easy conversation about small things. The cattle weathering the winter well. Ruth Ann's progress with arithmetic at the school in town. Samuel's plans for spring planting. "Mr. Peterson says I'm good with numbers," Ruth Ann said, spearing a piece of potato. "You get that from your grandmother," Marcus said, and his voice was steady. "Catherine was sharp with numbers, could do sums in her head faster than I could write them down." It was the first time he'd spoken Catherine's name with warmth instead of pain. Ruth Ann noticed, smiled, didn't make a big thing of it, just filed it away as another sign that the man across from her was healing, same as she was. After dinner, Ruth Ann did homework at the table. Marcus read the newspaper. Samuel whittled by the fire, his knife making soft scraping sounds against wood. Domestic, peaceful, normal, family. When it was bedtime, Marcus walked Ruth Ann to her room. Not Clara's room anymore. Ruth Ann's room. They'd spent a day cleaning it together, washing the windows, beating the dust from the curtains, airing out the quilts. The porcelain doll sat on a shelf now, honored but not hidden. Rosie, watching over a new child, a living child. There were new things too, Ruth Ann's drawings tacked to the wall, her school books stacked neat on the desk, hair ribbons hanging from the bedpost, signs of a life being lived instead of a memory being preserved. Marcus tucked her in. He was still learning how. Still awkward, but earnest. That counted for something. "Tell me about Clara," Ruth Ann asked. It had become their ritual. Every night she asked about Clara, and every night Marcus told her something new. A memory he'd locked away that was finally safe to open. "What do you want to know tonight?" "What was her favorite song?" "You Are My Sunshine." Catherine sang it every night before bed. Ruth Ann looked at him, hopeful. "Will you sing it to me?" Marcus hesitated. He hadn't sung in 20 years. Hadn't thought his voice still knew how. But Ruth Ann was looking at him with those gray-blue eyes, and somewhere in his chest, something that had been frozen for 19 years was finally warm enough to move. He sang, quiet, rough, but sincere. "You are my sunshine, my only sunshine. You make me happy when skies are gray." His voice cracked on the second line, but he kept going. "You'll never know, dear, how much I love you. Please don't take my sunshine away." Ruth Ann's eyes closed, a smile on her face. Safe, loved, home. Marcus finished the song and stood in the doorway, watching her sleep. Like he'd watched Clara. Like he'd tried to watch Catherine. But different now. Not haunted by ghosts, accompanied by memories. Not locked in the past, present in the present. "Good night, Ruth Ann," he whispered. He almost added, "I love you." The words were there, waiting on his tongue. Not quite ready yet, but soon. Soon he'd be able to say them. Soon he'd be able to mean them without the weight of 19 years of grief crushing the words before they could form. Soon. He turned out the light and walked to the living room, looked out the window at the iron sun gate. Snow was falling gently. The gate stood open. A beacon, a promise. The lamp burned in the east window. Someone lives here now. Someone's home. Marcus Thorne, 48 years old, millionaire rancher, father of 2 daughters, one in the ground and one asleep down the hall, sat in his chair by the fire. Samuel had gone to the bunkhouse. The house was quiet except for the crack of burning wood and the soft sound of Ruth Ann's breathing from her room. He closed his eyes, and for the first time in 19 years, Marcus Thorne went to bed and dreamed of springtime. The snow would melt, the grass would grow, the cattle would calve, and in Clara's grave on the hill, where Catherine had planted wildflower seeds 20 years ago, the flowers would bloom again. Purple and yellow and white, covering the stone with color, covering the grief with life. Spring always came, even after the longest winter, even after you thought you'd frozen so solid you'd never thaw. And Marcus Thorne, who'd been winter for 19 years, was finally ready to let it.